I know it's late in the day. Thank you for your patience. I am Betsy Olnick-Dougherty. I'm principal of Perkins Eastman Dougherty, representing the educational facilities portfolio here in California. And we have an amazing panel with us today, and we're going to do something a little bit different because we realize that we are wrapping up the day. And we have a fall equinox which will not be late. So we want to be there on time, and we also have posters that we want to have a chance to see. So I'm going to begin by introducing our panel. We have architects, neuroscientists, educators, and researchers here, so I think you'll appreciate the wonderful opportunity we have to have this discussion. We are going to have a discussion and pose questions. Each panelist will speak to a question, then we're going to open it to the audience, 5 minutes per question, or we're not going to get through this. And I've been told we have 45 minutes, so it's a promise we're all making, right? So in addition to myself, we have Dr. Claire Gallagher, Associate AIA Professor at George and Court University. Claire. Next to her is John Dale, FAIA Lead AP with HED Architects. Both Claire and John have been very active in the Committee for Architects for Education with AIA. Next is Dr. Tom Albright, who is here at the Salk Institute. Oh, I'm sorry. You guys are not sitting in the right place, are you? Okay. So, well, I've introduced Tom, so Tom, raise your hand. And Lenny Scott Weber, who you have all met, is managed to sit there in between him. And we also are privileged to have Huda Kild with us, who is our keynote speaker earlier, so she'll have the opportunity to speak from her perspective as well. So we really see this as an opportunity for sort of a daily wrap-up. And as you know, today started with correctional facilities and is ending with education, which is kind of an interesting, there's some interesting common themes here. But the one I'd like to throw out first and foremost is we really haven't addressed creativity and inspiration within all of our spaces, what looks to cognition and quality of life. And so we're very interested, of course, in supporting learning and teaching. And I'm not moving forward here. Not happening. How about if we move over here? Okay, well, maybe I will stand here and do this then. So these are the contemporary issues that we're looking at together as a group. And this is just a very brief introduction. So you're going to see the questions come up. And for question number one, we really want to focus this conversation about safety while we're also looking at nurturing inspirational, supportive environments for learning and cognition. So I'm going to ask the first question of John Dale. And that question is, what are the physical manifestations for designing for safety and while positively influencing teaching and learning for students and for teachers? John.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to start by actually sharing a few anecdotes. Being a practitioner and not a scientist, I guess I tend to tell stories.
I told you I'm a timekeeper, John, just saying.
Okay. So, but the two scenarios are this. First one, a Board of Education meeting. We've just finished the design of a new science building at a high school in Orange County. Very transparent, very open, big entry porch. And the students on the student representatives of the board, one of the students raised a hand and said, "Those windows look awfully big. I'm worried about my security. I'm not sure that we're safe." The second anecdote, which followed a year or so later, we're in the process of designing a very large educational classroom, multi-purpose classroom building for Santa Monica High School. And all about transparency, interconnected spaces, teaching happening outside the classroom and so forth. And all lauded by the Board of Education and by the facilities people. Well, the teachers union met and came back to us with a series of comments, one of them being, what sort of film are we going to have to put on the glass? How are we going to protect ourselves in the event of a shooting? So let me contrast two sets of characteristics which could be associated with, in the eyes of different people, a safe, nurturing environment. We can talk about transparency, we can talk about interconnected spaces, indoor-outdoor relationships, the idea of adjustability, of differentiated spaces and layers. And you could argue that that is nurturing, that it creates a sense of well-being and safety and interconnectedness. And on the other hand, we're getting the message from some that we actually need opacity, separation, controlled spaces. And you know, I actually started thinking about Huda's comment about the impact of solitary confinement on the brain. Mm-hmm. So we have been engaged in discussions with concerned users because of this context of shootings. And and my last parting comment, where I'd like to really immediately begin to engage you in some of your own experiences. And of course, I'm at risk of overgeneralizing, but it is interesting to me to think about a series of the most horrendous episodes that have taken place over the last few years. And I would say there's no particular correlation between what has happened and the spaces where they have occurred. And it's a question I pose of the people who are raising the security issues to us. Is a shooting more likely to happen in an open space or in a windowless classroom? The last horrendous shooting was an instance of a student walking into his own classroom and opening fire. So no matter what the characteristics of that classroom had been, the incident would have been the same. So I wanted to start our discussion together, whether any of you would like to share similar experiences of discussions around security, and what we're really talking about here is the kind of emotional perception of what is a secure and nurturing learning environment.
Anybody like to contribute to the conversation? We have a lot of questions on this subject, but I'd like to take maybe two.
Who's got the mic?
And we have mics going around.
And then there's someone in the back.
All right, thanks for your comments, John. So since you kind of brought up that that student on the board was concerned for safety, it does kind of reflect the culture of fear that is being fed to our students and just to society at large in the United States. So I guess I'd like to just hear some discussion or ideas on what we can do to, if not do away with that culture of fear, what can we do to lessen its influence on students in the school environment while still meeting those demands for safe and secure schools? Just something for us to think about.
Well, we're gonna touch on emotion. It's coming.
Excellent.
With Huda. So if you can kind of hold that thought. We had a lot of questions, so I'd like to ask one more. Yes.
Yeah, very quickly. When I've been following the school shootings for some time, thinking about them, because we actually did a project on banks for the Bank Administration Institute back in the mid-'80s that had the same question, and is, could you design banks to deter bank robbers? And there was two lines of thinking in the bank. One was we have to target harden them like crazy, and the other group, the marketing people, wanted to open them up and make people feel happy and welcome. And it turned out, we did the study, and it turned out the answer was none of them. But if you look at how bank robberies actually occurred, from how they picked out the bank to how they actually performed it, bank robbers relied on very, very key features of the bank's environment that even the bank robber couldn't tell you they relied on. They just said it felt right. And if you removed those key features or altered them, you stopped the bank robberies. You dropped the opportunity for them tremendously. And this was published, and there was a book written on it and everything like that. I think the same approach could be taken now with schools, because I know that those students, even though they're probably very troubled individuals, they are still relying on key features of settings that to them allow them to proceed through their plan and do this. And I think that an approach could be taken that removes those or alters those that would greatly affect the incidence of these kinds of situations.
It's very interesting. Thank you. If you don't mind, we're going to go to number 2. And we're going to ask Tom Albright, our neuroscientist, who has a specialty in visual perception, to address the physical safety features that might negatively impact the learning environment that we find are being used very commonly in reaction to this trend. Tom?
So I'm not going to talk about how you achieve security. I'm going to talk about how the manifestations of that affect the psychology of the people who are being secured. The most common form of learning is what's known as associative learning. Associative learning is also probably the most important form of learning in the ways that it impacts our behavior and our cognitive state. And there are trappings of security, imagery of security facilities that we've associated with threat and fear. I'm talking about the things that you've all seen on television, you see in magazines and newspapers, weapons, armor, bars, gates, chains. And those things alone will elicit the fear and the sense of threat by association. And so if we're going to secure these facilities without terrorizing the students in the process, we need to find ways of securing them that don't have that association, that don't have that imagery associated with them. There are examples of this in other disciplines. The airline industry deals with a similar kind of problem. You get on an airline and you want to feel secure for a whole variety of reasons. Mm-hmm. And there are no bars on the airplanes. There are no weapons, or not that you're aware of. There are on a small fraction of planes, there are federal marshals. You don't know who they are. You don't know whether they're there or not. It's all done under the radar for you. And it works. It makes people feel secure because they're there and they're not faced with the trappings of security. And so we need to find ways of doing that in the schools as well. And you can imagine lots of things that involve cameras. Simply knowing what's going on is important without having armed guards. Many of you will remember the days after September 11th, and you would go to the airport and there were guys walking around the airport with machine guns. And this is absolutely terrifying, to have people like that in your presence, to live in a world like that. I mean, I realize this happens in many other countries of the world routinely, but it doesn't happen in this country, at least not within my lifetime, other than just after September 11th. And so putting that in a school is going to do nothing but terrorize the children, even though it's part of an effort to provide security.
Would anybody like to comment or have a question? Yes, in front here.
This is just an example from a police facility design approach. Obviously, you need to, the trucks that are full of explosives, we have to keep them away from the building. And there are all these design approaches that are invisible, such as bollards, which are benches, and drop-away lawns that take the truck down 6 feet. And I think that kind of creativity needs to be implemented and thought about within the schools so that these younger children and these the facility managers and teachers are guarded from that fear factor. So this is just an example from a different segment.
The only risk is that we continue to develop new associations. So all these new innovations we then associate with this, as Danny put it earlier, this culture of fear, this threat associated with those things because they're used to prevent the threats.
Yes, up in front with Melissa, and then there's one more in the back, and then we're going to move on.
Thank you. So it seems to me that there's two things that we're talking about. There's actually making a school secure physically, and then there's a feeling of safety.
Which is what we want to focus
on. And we want to focus, right. And I think some of also what you were talking about earlier, I think John are alluding to, was some of the things that we were talking about earlier today, and Huda was talking about too, which somehow being able to give a student a feeling of control, because there's that lack of control, like you mentioned. Somebody might feel like they need a smaller window or no window. Somebody else might like to be able to see outside and see what's coming. And so there's different things, and then also providing choice, so.
Thank you. We had a question in the back.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, but in France, after the terrorist attacks in Nice, I heard people saying that they were happy to see policemen and with weapons on the streets to protect them. So how could we have the good balance between them two? Because the fact to have people with weapons, well, I mean, policemen, they reinsure them.
I think this is a fair point. It's sort of related to what Melissa was saying a moment ago, and John and Claire and I had a discussion about this earlier today. That is, there are individual differences. I was making generalizations about human behavior, but there are people who grow up in a culture in which they feel protected by the armor, by the gates. This gives them a sense of security. There are other people who grow up without that, and in the presence of those stimuli become terrified because they're associated with threat. So I don't know how we get the right balance to make everybody feel secure. What's the neuroscience of this? Well, the neuroscience is simply associative learning. Huda will tell you more about the emotional aspects of it. That's her expertise.
We're getting to that now.
But my point is simply that that associative learning is ubiquitous. It's unavoidable, and we associate these things, and then given those stimuli, we naturally have a response, a fear response, even though there is nothing threatening us at that moment. The feeling of threat is caused by the stimulus that's part of the apparatus to make us secure.
And Huda is going to address question number 3 from her perspective, her neuroscience background, regarding physical attributes that relate to the emotional perception. And not just safety and security, but consequently fear and insecurity, because of course as we've discussed, we're sort of looking at both sides of the coin. Huda.
Well, so this is a great discussion just because every time I thought I was going to say something, somebody else already has said it. So we've already really been talking about nothing but this question of emotion and how we handle it, and how we handle it both in reality, in the real world, but also the perception from the students, from their parents, from the teacher, etc. How we not only achieve security, but ensure that in the process we're not terrifying people or changing the culture or interfering with the education and making it more about, just barricading ourselves instead of opening ourselves. And how do you create that in the physical environment? That is the challenge. One thing that we do know is that when we experience fear and go back to it and it gets re-triggered, we're really rewriting that memory de novo. There is like new protein synthesis in the brain, new epigenetic changes, new rewriting of fear memories. And there are differences based on the conditions in which we do that and how that gets done, and also the different people. And some of them rewrite them and make them stronger, and sometimes you change the context. And that's what we were trying to do with our rats earlier, where we're saying, this is a safe context, this is okay, and you can take those same stimuli, the same associated stimuli, but interpret them differently. You could take something like the screening at the airport that we go through and start off by saying, my God, we're living in a military state now. We can't even get on a plane without somebody screening us, to saying, no, they're doing their job, it's routine, and it doesn't distress us anymore. So we can reinterpret and adapt these things based on experience and reinterpretation of the meaning of the stimuli. But I think, to Tom's point, some stimuli are very strong and would be hard to ignore, like a gun in your face, no matter how many times you see it. I grew up in Syria. Believe me, it never gets habitual. It's always scary. Versus the screening and, at the airport and, looking at my eyes or whatever they do before they let me in, that's just like routine. I don't feel it. So we need to pick our poisons. We need to be strategic by understanding what it is that people do, and then help navigate between feeling like you know there are options as a teacher, as a student. So there is a sense of control. So instead of saying we're vulnerable because we're open, saying no, we have a strategy, there is a plan. And making them aware of the plan, but not living with the plan and contextualizing the whole thing. The final thing I will say is this individual difference between kids and people in general is really important. It's adaptive. It's adaptive to have some of us love to go out in the open and look openly and explore and find good things. It's good for the population and for that species, and then to have some burrowing and staying safe in the face of danger. And what's happened to American schools is from being completely safe, they've moved to the real world of evolution, where sometimes it's safe and sometimes it's not, and it's comfortable for some and it's really terrifying for others. So I really liked the conceptualizations that we heard in the previous two talks. One is about asking the kids. I really think it's important, getting input on them, including on this particular thing. And the other is balancing the two ideas of arousal and exploration versus comfort by creating different types of spaces that might be within the same school, let's say, appropriate for when you're feeling like you need comfort for versus exploration.
Thank you. Would anybody like to contribute or ask a question? We got lots of hands up. White shirt right there. We've got the mic coming toward you. And then if we can select somebody on this side with this mic right now so that we're queued up. Thank you.
I see it as a shift in the shift of the sense of the space or the type of safety the students are looking for. In the early 1990s, working with San Diego Unified in the Mid-City area, I was in a 7th grade classroom talking to the students about what they want to see in their new middle school. And their biggest fear at that time was walking from home to school, school to home, getting beat up. That was the safety issue at that time. But one student started a real conversation in the classroom saying he wanted metal detectors at all the doors. And he wanted Charger football players walking the hallways. And it just grew. All the students started getting into it. And I'd say probably a third of the students were active conversationalists in this conversation. And they were expressing their fears in the building as well as on the street. So it's been around a while, and I don't think we've really adequately addressed it.
Well, my husband, who's old like me, tells me about when he was a kid and they were afraid of nuclear attacks, and there were places you would go down and hide and be ready for it. So it comes and goes in a variety of ways.
Under your desk.
That's right.
We have our question over here, and then if there's another one on this side, let's cue that one up. So yes.
I was just going to contribute because, like John Dale, I'm designing schools all the time, and it's not one size fits all in terms of security ever. But in the central of Chicago, what we're doing is layering envelopes so that we make beautiful biophilic perforated metal siding that is safe, but you can see out through, and it can be stimulating and inviting and all of those things, but it also can be very safe. And then creating courtyards in the center of the building that is very safe and secure, but beautiful and observed and other things. So safety can be beautiful, and it is not one size fits all. And a fence can also be beautiful, too.
Hard and soft at the same time.
Exactly.
There was another question over here.
Yeah, so I guess this is from the perspective of a student who was on a campus during a school shooting when I was in college. And it happened when I was in an auditorium very similar to this, and it was outside of the room. And the lack of visual connection with what was going on outside was, I guess, one of the more concerning aspects, just not knowing what was going on outside until we were informed. So I guess, how can we keeping a sense of openness as well, not just locking it up, because openness also contributes to a sense of security, I think, sometimes.
Thank you. We're going to move on to question number 4, which is for Lenny. And Lenny has a lot of influence in, as you know, and from her background that she's already explained to you. So we're going to ask her the question regarding designs for safety and designs for innovative teaching and learning, which we really want to emphasize here. And are they mutually exclusive, and how can we enhance them simultaneously like we would find a security solution that was had the biophilic side to it as well as the safety side to it? So Lenny.
That's a big question. So personal experience, I was a professor at Virginia Tech, April 16th. So one of the first major shootings in this country. My colleague died that day, my neighbor died that day, and it was a student. If you look at the record, and this was in Norris Hall, which was a really old building. I mean, it's, you know, all little rabbit warrens and everything else. There was no open anything. To Tom's point, I think safety and security has always been important. It always will be important, but I think perhaps, I'm not the cognitive neuroscience, but there is something called the neocortex, where our primal brain holds that fright or flight syndrome in there, and I just wonder how much are we stimulating it with all of these artifacts that are saying, this is a ghetto, we're fearful of this, to the outward signs of that, and the things that you're talking about that are there, but are beautifully enhanced, and maybe it's not even what you know. The idea of being able to be, so the majority of us that are in design or in laboratory spaces, it's about this interconnection with one another that we learn from. And it's very kinesthetic. We're all, you know, all of our senses are involved in that learning and that openness to that learning. I don't want us to forget that when we think about design. It's so important as an educator, as a longtime professor, as some of my colleagues are, it's so important to be able to share that love of learning. I mean, I've failed at retirement twice, and I'm still out here, you know, so it's so critical. I think we just have to be creative, but we also have to respect the fact that communication is huge. And many times we're involved in architectural design for educational scenarios, and they don't want the educators at the table. They don't want the students at the table. God forbid you'd have the parents. I mean, how in the world are you going to communicate these ideas and your why without being able to have the conversations and to be out without being able to educate? Even educating, you know, when you're looking at an innovative teaching environment and your parents are saying, well, sitting in a row is good enough for me. Why isn't it good enough for my kid? We have to be able to have the conversations, and I think the more opportunity you have for conversation and to share from knowledge and research, the more people begin to respect what you're trying to do and share with them and for the children of the future of this country and others. So I think it's really important to, you know, keep the blinders on. Why are we doing this? Why is it important?
Yes, we have a question here in the first row.
Gosh, I'm just filled with all kinds of thoughts about this. My first, I would just share a couple of them, but they're kind of a question, though. My first one, because we do security planning, is we're talking about very low probability, very high consequence events, and how much resources and what kind of resources we put toward them, and they're extraordinarily unpredictable. I mean, it's a horrendous problem, way too many of these events, but what percentage of schools have actually experienced a shooting like this? I don't know, but it's tiny. It's unacceptable, but it's tiny. And then I was thinking, well, something really different happened this year with the Parkland shooting, and the students have been out there, and they have been unbelievable. I've been so moved by their engagement
Social
and
media
their comments and what they're trying to do. And I'm thinking, and this reminds me also of the comment that I received earlier, like, is it ethical to be designing prisons and jails at this point, or especially solitary confinement ones, and that's something we face as architects. But why aren't we talking about getting rid of the weapons?
Well,
Sorry.
It's a whole nother layer.
Right.
Little provocative
Yes,
comment, yes. And do we have another comment for this one? Back row on this side, right there. And then one in the balcony, in the middle. Yes?
Okay. To address your comment, the percentages are low, but the perception of possibility is enormous. And that's, in the next question, that's what I'm going to address. But, yeah.
Okay.
Stay tuned.
Yes, question in the back?
So it seems to me that freedom of movement is another key to this that hasn't necessarily been discussed on this panel, and that we've seen today in demonstrated relationships between movement and learning and mental well-being. And we've also seen how fear and anxiety can reduce the ability for the freedom of movement, the
Right.
feeling freedom. And it seems like a lot of the strategies that we're seeing here create safety through reduction of freedom of movement. And so there's a complex sort of interrelationship here that I think is worth.
I don't think you have to reduce the freedom of movement. I mean, you're really back at Maslow's hierarchy. You have to have that sense of security before you can really, and shelter before you can kind of move forward. But there's lots of different ways. I mean, it's about education also. If I can see out, to this lady's thing, if I can see out, I have a better sense of what's going on and I know how to react. So as a longtime educator, I want to know that. These kind of things with full walls and that sort of make me more nervous than if I'm in a raw, open environment. So,
But it's idiosyncratic, too, because there are people who don't want to be seen, and they feel incredibly threatened by somebody being able to see them from a vantage point they can't anticipate through a window that's adjacent to wherever they are. So it is very idiosyncratic. I don't think it's one size fits all at all.
Just to go back to my anecdote about Santa Monica High School, the building we went back and analyzed the building again and considered all the different choices that people had within that plan. So it's a very open plan, but there are some rooms that are more open than others. Many rooms are interconnected. So we thought about the concept of refuge areas. I mean, Robin, to your point about the exterior, the same is true with the interior. You can think of a layered approach. You may have a glass wall between you and your neighbor, but you have the ability to obscure it if you need to for some reason. And so having those layers and having those choices goes along with the freedom of a more fluid teaching environment.
There's one more question down the balcony.
Just very quickly, to answer that question, no, they're not mutually exclusive. The control loops, the perceptual control loops that enhance teaching and learning, they run through different features of the setting than those that deal with safety. One of the state of Washington, go look up the big study they did on deterring vandalism in schools. And a lot of the strategies to deter vandalism, you don't even notice anymore. They don't affect the educational environment at all, is because if you're going to vandalize a setting, you rely on different features or characteristics of the setting than if you're going to manipulate the setting to learn in it. Just like we found out in the bank robbery study, the inter-teller distance between tellers was the single most important variable on deterring a bank robber. We don't even notice the inter-teller distance if we're going in there to use a bank. So the point is, you can have very normal interactions in settings, and if you've studied it properly, you can detect what the miscreant is using to actually help carry out their acts, and you can design against it. So that's my final point here.
Thank you. Claire will address question number 5, which really draws upon her own personal experience in terms of teaching teachers and administrators. So it's really talking about how these principles can be understood and appreciated by teachers, administrators, and going into board members, parents. So this goes all the way back into the home. Can safe schools also offer alternative and progressive learning environments? Claire.
Okay, so I'm in the unusual position of being somebody from the world of architecture who's teaching in a school of education. And I've been doing this now, teaching pre-service school administrators and teachers for almost 20 years. So my experience is pretty vast in this. I supervise people in schools, I'm in and out of schools constantly, as well as teaching people to teach math and science and to do research and to prepare to be school administrators. And I am on the fence. I think that it is possible to harden and soften schools to achieve both the pedagogical and the perception of safety issues. But I do think, in response to several of the comments, that it's trust on the part of the occupant of the school that the place you inhabit is safe. I don't know that you have to see the things that are keeping you safe, but you have to have a very strong sense that you are safe there, whether you're teaching or not. And in terms of what's driving this concern, I don't think that there's anybody in here who hasn't thought about school hardening, for instance. I don't know how many of you have thought about school softening, but school hardening, it affects absolutely everybody. And teaching in a school of education, I can also tell you that there is no exposure, at least in my 20 years of doing this, there is no exposure for people who are learning to become school administrators or educators in pre-service programs in school design. No. There isn't anything. And then these individuals are put in a setting where they might be contributing to a school design, or they might be in charge of a school design. And all of these things are completely mysterious to them. They just don't know. So they are your clients. On top of that, we have this mass hysteria that I think the media has contributed a great deal to. The teachers and the administrators with whom I come in contact are influenced a tremendous amount, not by what they've experienced, but by what they've heard. And that's showing up in so many things, particularly in things like, even with children in schools who are now designing things for school attacks. They're designing them. Like a wall that, I was just telling John about this earlier, I was reading about a child who developed, I think it was a 6th or 7th grader, a wall, basically, that comes apart as you sit against it, and you can pull it all around you and your friends to keep you safe from whoever is intruding in your room. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. But it is so pervasive that last Sunday in the Eat column of the New York Times, there was an article by Gabrielle Hamilton, who is the owner chef at Prune in New York, who wrote about making French fries for her son because she was so upset about what he was thinking at the moment, which was he was running for student council. His whole platform was to get curtains for his room, his classroom, and for the school. So when you start to read about it in something like the Eat column of the New York Times, that's even more alarming to me than hearing it in one of my classes in a school of education. So I don't know. I have more questions than anything else about how do we use the data? How do we use studies that have been done? How do we get this into the hands of the people who are really contributing a tremendous amount to school design on the other end, on the education end? And I don't know the answer to that question.
Thank you, Claire. We are running out of time, so if you will forgive us, we're going to go to straight to the next question, because we'd like Tom and Hu to have a chance to kick this around a little bit, and it's looking at the history of the violence in our schools. Isn't that something to say? How can the physical solution aggravate or mitigate the outcome? Relationships between incident and setting, defensible space. If the two of you would like to address that, we literally have, 2-3 minutes left here. And then our panelists will be available after the formal proceedings, if you'd like to stick around.
I mean, in a way, we answered it by saying that the physical, it's not so much the intrinsic physical settings, for the same reason that it's very unpredictable, exactly whether it's going to come from the inside or the outside, and exactly what tool and weapon and so on. So there's never going to be a perfect physical setting. I think the discussion of nested kind of levels of security is very appealing to me, because I think it achieves a number of things at the same time. I think a lot of it is what you're talking about. It's a social, psychological contagion of the question. And to me, that is, the architecture only can go so far as solving this issue, but in the context is that bigger social context of how you're gonna make kids safe in our society. Is it by taking guns? Is it by arming the teachers? Or like all the extremes of craziness that we have heard about. So I don't know that I have anything more to add.
And I agree. I think we addressed this in all the comments that were made. I will give you an anecdote, which is relevant to the campus that we're on, and relevant to a lot of the things that we've been discussing. For 50 years, the Salk Institute was an open campus. It was, the gates were opened at 8 o'clock in the morning. They were closed at 6 p.m., so it was locked overnight. It is private property. And a couple of years ago, there were increasing concerns about threats from the outside. And the administration, and this is a difficult territory to navigate, the administration had to make those people, the people who are complaining, feel comfortable. And so the solution was to lock the gates. And the problem with this, we talked earlier about freedom of movement. And freedom of movement, there's physical freedom of movement, but in an academic institution like this, it sort of symbolizes the nature of academic research. It's an open campus. We're doing this for free. We share. We share with anybody who wants. They can come here and they can talk to us anytime. It's a symbolic thing. And when I see those gates locked, it disturbs me a great deal, in addition to the inconvenience that's caused by the people who come and visit me. And I think that we have to find better solutions to these problems. We need to make the people on a campus like this feel comfortable. To be honest, I had my wallet stolen from my office once, but I've never felt uncomfortable. I've never felt threatened. But there are people who do, and I appreciate that. But we have to find a better solution than locking the gates.
We'd like to leave you with a question. And if it can be sort of a takeaway for all of us, because I think that the point here is that those people in this room and all of our related professions are those people who are ultimately responsible for these outcomes. So it's not just safety and security, but as we discussed, it's also all about the inspiration and the innovation and being able to achieve all of those goals seamlessly. I think that we'd like just to put that challenge out to you. Do we have time for just a few questions in the end? Can we do that? Yes? Question here?
What I'm surprised hasn't come up explicitly is the issue before the shooting even happens, that it's a mental health. So oftentimes the people that perpetuate this are students that have, somewhat known issues. And what I'm really optimistic about is that the direction, the 2 questions ago where we talk about these unique types of learning environments. I think it's 100% in line with a more safe and secure school, because we're talking about moving away from these boxes and a teacher and only 25 students to small learning communities where you have more than one adult that knows, every single student has at least one adult that knows them well, and they have students and they're building a community. And that's the direction every school I've worked on, that is their focus, is talking about how can we build collaboration skills, communication skills. We want relationships in a community. And if we go that direction, then I think we'll see less and less of the mental health issues that then lead to the shootings. And just to go in terms of the actual physical space, there's also tons of ways to shut, when you have a small learning neighborhood, if we're talking practicality's sake, you can shut down the entrance to the neighborhood instead of a classroom. So instead of being locked in a box, you're locked in a lovely open space with windows with 150 other students. So it's a lot more pleasant and a lot less obvious. So I'm an optimist, and I think the direction that architecture is going and pedagogy is going is in a beneficial spot in regards to safety and security. So.
I think that is a wonderful way to close our conversation. Thank you. We could talk all night about this, I'm sure, so we can get to talk about it after the poster session and out on the patio to watch the sunset. Thank you all. And thank you, panel.